Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. Thank you for joining us here at the CIGI Campus for today's address by the Premier of Ontario, the Honourable Kathleen Wynne, on the subject of Ontario in the world, prosperity and sustainability. I'd like to recognize that we have many elected members of provincial and municipal governments in our audience today, including by proximity MPP Catherine Fife of Kitchener-Waterloo riding, MPP Diane Vernile of Kitchener Centre, and MPP Catherine McGarry of Cambridge. And City of Waterloo Mayor David Jaworski and City of Cambridge Mayor Doug Craig are here as well, and many councillors from all of our local cities, townships, and Waterloo Regional Council. We also have presidents of universities, not-for-profits, foundations, and private companies in our esteemed audience, and a particularly strong showing from the academic sector that's engaged in climate studies. And the police chief, so behave. Following her formal remarks, the Premier will be joined in a discussion on stage by the President of CIGI, Rohinton Medora. And Rohinton will have with him the cards that were available in the foyer before this event during the Food for Thought lunch, inviting audience members to suggest questions for the Premier. And given the time constraints, he won't work his way through all those questions, but we'll try to reflect them in the discussion. And now to make a few introductory remarks and to more formally introduce the Premier, I'd like to invite to the podium a global entrepreneur and philanthropist who epitomizes the theme of Ontario in the world, the founder and chair of CIGI. Please welcome Jim Balsley.
Thank you very much, Fred, and welcome everybody. Premier Wynne, it's a pleasure to host you today in my hometown of Waterloo. And welcome to all of our visiting dignitaries. I have the honor of chairing the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we commonly refer to it. This institution, in a relatively short time, has become a beacon of how a partnership between different levels of government, our academic community, and the private sector can come together to lead, not only in a Canadian context, but in a global context as well. The province of Ontario has been a partner, a contributor, and a champion of CIGI since its inception. Through the Decade Fund, this institution has been given a runway to study the most important issues facing the province, Canada, and the world. This very building we stand in would not be possible without the generous support of all Ontarians. And most recently, Premier, your government invested in the creation of our international law program. On behalf of everyone here at CIGI, I want to thank you for your government's ongoing support. As I mentioned, these investments have given us the ability to put Canada at the forefront of the debate on the most pressing global issues of our time. For example, our Global Commission on Internet Governance helping navigate the uncharted waters of public policy affecting the Internet. Our Arctic Governance Initiative is focusing on the international governance opportunities and challenges to realizing the full economic and social potential of this region. And on a related theme, our new international law program is focusing significant attention and resources to addressing the global governance challenges facing the environment. This is the subject that I'm quite passionate about and what brings us together today. I am hopeful that our work here at CIGI will help shape a uniquely Canadian path for our province and country to turn this current adversarial nature between the economy and the environment into a false dichotomy. Premier, call me an optimist, but I believe it can be done. I had the honor to serve as the private sector representative on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on sustainability. During that time, I got to know South Korea's highly respected former Prime Minister, Dr. Han Sang-soo, who also served on the panel. Under the leadership of Dr. Han, Korea dedicated the majority of its fiscal stimulus during the global economic downturn in 2008 to what can be characterized as green growth. The real story is told in the OECD's Green Growth Strategy Report. It shows that Japan and Korea possess the most intellectual property rights on renewable energy of any country after the United States. In each year of the past decade, only Korean, Japanese, and American companies have been in the top 10 list of US patent filers in this sector. In the tech sector, protectable ideas, known as intellectual property rights, are an important benchmark of opportunity and growth. If I can boil it down for you, in less than a decade, in Korea, the dichotomy between economy and environment appears to be resolved. Green growth is good business. My optimism for charting our own path in this regard isn't groundless. As chair of the federal fund that invests in promising technologies that contribute to both our economy and environment, I've had the pleasure of meeting Canadian entrepreneurs in the clean tech space. In my estimation, they have the education, passion, and business savviness to succeed. Our job as leaders must be to channel and scale their individual success into broader macroeconomic and environmental benefits for all Canadians. I know the Premier shares my passion for a pragmatic solution to this global challenge. Passion and pragmatism are two attributes that are often associated with Kathleen Wynne. I know that education is another subject that the Premier is deeply passionate about. It was part due this very important area of public policy that motivated her to enter public life. And it is in this spirit that the Government of Ontario invests in leading research institutions like CIGI. Premier, thank you for being here today and for your government support of this institution. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Premier Wynne.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon, Ani, bonjour. It's, am I echoing here? Is it because of this mic? I'm talking to tech people now. Can we turn off the one I've got on my lapel while I'm doing this? How's that? Is that better? Okay. Okay, great. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Centre for International Governance and Innovation, and thank you very much, Jim, for the introduction, but more than that, thank you for everything that you do to help us all understand what innovation is and how to get there, and to make innovation synonymous with the Greater Waterloo region. Thank you very, very much. Yes. So I want to begin by recognizing the long history of First Nations and Métis people in Ontario and show respect today to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. One of the reasons that I like history is because of the way it opposes the conventional wisdom of our day. But the great books of history chronicle something even more powerful, I think, and that's the people who disrupted the conventional wisdom of their day. The people who stood up against the zeitgeist to offer a new way of thinking and a new way of organizing society. In this, I think history holds the power to revolutionize our thought and inject humility into the notion that the knowledge of our time will outlast us. I was privileged this morning to have the opportunity to sit at a round table with some very smart people who I think are doing their best to disrupt the zeitgeist and find ways of pushing us to a new way of organizing society. And I want to thank everyone who took part in the roundtable this morning. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for giving me some time. But we could argue that those whose thinking altered the trajectory of human prosperity have something in common with those whose thinking did not. They all lived at a self-described critical juncture of history. Galileo, the famous five, the leaders of the civil rights movement, all saw their work as necessary and a reaction to the critical moment in history, one that would put humanity on a path to greater prosperity. And history proved them right. But that same history is also littered with critical junctures that never delivered the true progress or resulted in the transformative change that was possible. So in 2015, with more than 7 billion humans, rising emissions, accelerating consumption, and failing ecosystems, the question that challenges us is, do we live at one such moment in history where future prosperity hinges on our ability to gather behind new ideas and at the same time discard the old? And that was some of what we were talking about this morning. The roundtable this morning, organized by CIGI, was a great discussion. Johan Rockström, whose work shows our planet facing a real and dangerous set of barriers to our survival, made it very clear to us, I think, that this moment is critical. The scientific evidence is abundant, it's compelling, it's clear, it cries out for urgent actions and reforms. But the way forward is not always as clear. It's considerably more opaque, although I know that in the discussion this morning there was clarity, and I know that there are clear paths forward. I think the conversation we had this morning demonstrates that in the clarity of the path, in that clarity when it connects with the pragmatism that Jim was talking about, and the real politic that Diane and Catherine and the other Catherine, I don't know if she's here, that we deal with, there's where the opacity comes in. So I'm going to talk today about how we're moving forward as a government to attempt to create the conditions for sustainable economic growth, about the role of government and business and NGOs like CIGI in creating sustainable prosperity in 2015 and beyond, and about the role of Ontario in a world facing those considerable challenges. And I started with history for a reason. First, we have to be willing to look at the evidence, we have to think differently, and we have to adapt. But the second reason I started with history is that we have to accept that we cannot predict history as it unfolds. Whether or not we live at a critical juncture, whether or not we'll achieve a truly sustainable path to prosperity, that's for history to decide in the looking back and the writing of that story. But whether or not we are leaders in our time, whether or not we heed the warnings of our collective intelligence and try our best to put prosperity on a more sustainable path, those decisions belong to us. And thanks to people all over the world, including the people here today, we are doing our very best to make the right decisions. We take climate change, which is now understood as the global challenge of our time and one that requires a truly global solution. But in both the political economy and in the real economy, there are disincentives in place that could be seen as barriers to strong action. For generations and still today, the modern Western notion of prosperity simply cannot be decoupled from the burning of fossil fuels. It's how we live, and it's how we live well. And without restating the science, which I know you're all aware of, it's accepted that our trajectory is not sustainable. Keep burning, and the only thing that's certain about our future prosperity is that it will look different. But if we want to do things differently, we can regain control. We can sustain prosperity in our lifetimes and those of future generations if we start and take action. In the international challenge of climate change, I recognize that Ontario is a minor player. We account for less than 1% of global emissions. But even as we remain among the most intensive per capita emitters of greenhouse gas in the world, we can also be a leader. CIGI and its partners make us thought leaders. And we're also leaders in transitioning to a low-carbon economy. The Green Energy Act accelerated our uptake of clean energy on the electricity grid, and last year when we closed coal-fired electricity generating plants for good, we completed North America's single largest action to curb GHG emissions to date. And we can feel very good about those efforts, but we can in no way be complacent. Globally and here in Canada, there is so much more to do. Regrettably, Canada is not yet a leader on climate change, but the opportunity is there, particularly because the economic and political realities surrounding emissions reduction in Canada parallel the global realities. We have that model. Certain regions of our country have industries that extract and export carbon-intensive energy, namely, of course, the Western provinces, as well as Newfoundland and Labrador. In central Canada, we import most of our fuel. Regulations to curb fossil fuel emissions could, therefore, have different and uneven impacts across the country, just as they could across the world. And like the world, the provinces all have different targets for reductions by 2020. They range in ambition from Alberta's 9.9% above 2005 levels to BC's 32% below 2005 levels. But Environment Canada is not the only one pointing out that with existing policies, we will all of us fall short of those targets. It was reported recently that 84% of Canadians feel that a country as rich as Canada has an obligation to show international leadership by reducing emissions. Another report revealed that most of us think that the federal government needs to step up and lead. And I agree with that. I agree that we need stronger federal leadership, particularly as the global community prepares to reach a new climate change agreement in Paris this December. Nous avons besoin d'un leadership fédéral plus fort. En décembre prochain à Paris, la communauté mondiale se prépare à conclure une nouvelle entente sur le changement climatique. And I think it's noteworthy that in Canada, consensus is building between environmental advocates and the business community, and that was a point that was made today. Both agree that strong federal leadership is needed to prevent a patchwork of policies that would further fragment our economic union. In many ways, building that kind of consensus is how Canada was founded, on the acknowledgement that we have more to gain by working together than apart. We have a history of using the evidence before us to come together as a country, change course, and deliver a new kind of prosperity. And we need to do that again. This is a point that I have been making frequently, the need for our leaders to renew Canadian federalism by building a new economic union, one that allows us to thrive in the 21st century just the way the social union created in the 1960s delivered Medicare, the Canada Pension Plan, and sustained 50 years of growth and prosperity. We had regional cleavages then, just as we do now. And that's the reality, obviously, of a diverse and vast country operating in an increasingly globalized world. And it's precisely why a Canada-wide framework on climate change is needed to renew and strengthen our federation. But we can't wait for that. So in the absence of federal leadership, provinces are stepping up. Next month, I'm attending a climate change summit in Quebec with other provinces. We'll discuss carbon pricing best practices and other work that we can do together. In July, I'm hosting a climate summit of the Americas to coincide with Ontario's hosting of the Pan American Games. And later this year, Ontario will come forward with a climate change action plan that will guide our next steps. And the consultation paper for that strategy is in the public realm at this point. And I'll continue to work with Canada's premiers to develop a Canadian energy strategy that includes efforts to reduce emissions and move toward a low-carbon economy. And one of the things that has been very important in that national discussion at the Premier's table is that if we are going to have a Canadian energy strategy, we have to recognize that efforts are going to look different province by province. But that does not preclude everyone making an effort and doing what they can. And so that's why I can have a very profitable and constructive conversation with Philippe Couillard, but also with Jim Prentice. Right across the country, we can have those discussions, and I believe we can put together a strategy that will demonstrate how serious we as provinces are. We have as a government the political will to act on the evidence and to ask other jurisdictions to do the same thing. But in all of these efforts, we look to the research and leadership of groups like CIGI for innovative ways of financing our response and strengthening treaties, for intellectual property expertise in the clean tech space, for insights as to how we can break global deadlocks. One such deadlock is fear that actions to reduce emissions will exacerbate the already great amount of inequality in the global economy. And I think the conversations that many of you are engaged in recognize that the reality is that inequality will be exacerbated by more inaction. All nations may have trouble finding the will to mitigate, but developed nations will have an easier time finding the wealth to adapt. The cost of extreme weather, food and water shortages, migration, these will be borne largely beyond our borders. Now, some would have us wait and see which ends up being the more costly approach, mitigation or adaptation. But we take issue with either being positioned as a cost. Yes, it will take capital, but properly invested, the returns outweigh the principal. And in business, I know that's called a cost. It's not called a cost, it's called an investment. It's the same reason that I talk about our economic plan by talking about the bigger picture. My political opposition suggests that we can't afford certain social expenditures. We can't have great schools, programs that lift children out of poverty, wage increases for personal support workers, to name a few. But my contention is that they are absolutely wrong. What we cannot afford is deeper poverty, growing inequality. What we cannot afford are ideologies that falsely separate the progress that we're making socially and environmentally with the progress that we're seeing economically. They are entwined, and they must be dealt with in policy terms in that way. RBC recently updated Ontario's forecast to 3.3% growth for this year, Canada's fastest growing economy in 2015. We're helped by the dollar and a rebounding US economy, but those things only combine in Ontario's interests because we make the right choices. When some were calling for deep cuts, we came forward with a plan that said we have to invest in growth. The fact that our province is now able to seize opportunities that were unavailable just 6 months ago also speaks to the merit of our plan and the merits of a government that sees economic growth not as an end unto itself, but as a means. And I'm just going to stop here because I'm acutely aware of the conversation that we had about growth this morning, and I understand that there is a necessary and I think important and challenging discussion about growth, what we mean by growth, how far growth goes, how infinite it is, and I understand that. But I also understand that the reality I'm living at this moment is that if we're going to have the kind of economic well-being that we are capable of, then growth is part of that discussion. And when I talk about economic growth, I am talking about not just financial growth. I'm talking about social equality. I'm talking about all of those pieces that lead to a higher quality of life. So we have made investments in the face of calls, because of our economic situation, calls to cut and slash, and we resisted those. We seek that growing economy because of what it means for people, for their opportunities, and for their security. So growth that serves only a small segment or is environmentally unsustainable is not only the wrong choice, it's economically self-destructive. So if they're connected in terms of positive progress, then economic and environmental sustainability are connected in terms of their ability to degrade if we don't make the right decisions. So our plan starts by investing in people, by investing in their talent and their skills, and in their capacity to thrive in a changing economy. Here in the capital of Ontario's startup and innovation culture, you know that our greatest advantage in the modern knowledge economy is our talented people. Sam Altman of Y Combinator, who I understand is known as the startup whisperer, a renowned seed funder for tech startups. He was asked recently if any one US college stood out for having students whose ideas took off. And he said yes, the University of Waterloo. So I think that's a compliment. The second part of our plan is building modern infrastructure. A big part of this is regional express rail, to just talk to some specifics, which moves our GO lines off diesel power and onto our clean grid. This initiative will shorten trip times, increase service, and it'll help people to switch from cars to trains. Right away, that carries noticeable environmental and quality of life benefits. And right away, it creates economic benefits at the same time. All-day two-way regional express rail from Toronto to Waterloo region will create an innovative supercluster of over 14,000 technology companies and 175,000 technology employees. Productivity is enhanced as people and goods move faster. A decreasing reliance on fuel imports improves our trade balance, and jobs are created directly and indirectly in the manufacturing and construction trades. But as everyone in this room knows, if we're going to build what is needed and build it quickly enough, we need to find new dollars. And Ed Clark, the former CEO of the TD Bank, is doing some very practical work to respond to that challenge. We will leverage the value of things that we've built over decades in order to raise the money that we need to build new assets for sustainable 21st century growth, notably our 10-year Moving Ontario Forward plan to build modern transportation infrastructure. Part of our review of government assets also includes alcohol distribution, and this is going to come back to sustainability, I promise. I'm not going to go off on a beer tangent. Well, just a little one. Not far from here is the Cambridge Gault Grand River Brewing Company, and this year they celebrated their 8th anniversary. The craft brewery employs 11 people, and recently they received a local food fund grant to expand capacity, hire more workers, and source more local ingredients in their beers. Their products are on shelves in Ontario, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, and they export to the northeastern United States. They're succeeding, even though decisions of past governments really stacked the market against them here in Ontario. If there was a level playing field here at home, they could be selling more product, hiring more people, and purchasing more local ingredients. So our government is looking at ways of correcting this imbalance by taking a more rational, fair approach to Ontario's alcohol market. The details of that plan are coming together, and I will have more to say about that in the coming weeks. But this is the third part of our plan, which is about creating a dynamic and innovative business environment. And we talked this morning a little bit about picking winners and losers, and how that was probably not the best role for government, although I would contend that in practical terms, we have to work with business and support businesses who are on a trajectory to expand. But more importantly, government needs to do the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is to create a more rational environment in which businesses can thrive. So we work with research and business communities, and through that our government's helping Ontario's established and emerging sectors to find new and sustainable ways of creating prosperity in the 21st century. And we have to look at sectors like the auto sector. Vehicle emissions account for a large share of our greenhouse gases, but vehicle manufacturing accounts for a large share of our economic prosperity. And there's the juxtaposition. As we encourage the transition to electric and zero-emission vehicles, we can't pretend that internal combustion engines are history. So we're working with our partners in the sector to position Ontario at the leading edge of automotive innovation. Our recent announced partnership with Linamar, for example, will see Ontario develop revolutionary transmission components to improve the fuel efficiency of gas-powered cars. On the other side of the equation, we're working with innovative startups like Kitchener-based Myovision, whose technology takes on traffic congestion in urban areas. And just by reducing the amount of time spent idling at intersections, Myovision can reduce emissions by as much as 20%. And Catherine McGarry's working in transportation on exactly this kind of innovation. How do we find those ideas that can put us on the right path? Recently, they received a $30 million vote of confidence in the form of venture capital. And Myovision is just one of 3,000 companies with 65,000 employees directly employed in Ontario's clean tech sector, which is Canada's largest and fastest growing in terms of investment. So, Ontario in the world, prosperity and sustainability. 20 years ago, that might have sounded like a contradiction, or at least it might have taken a lot of explaining. Sustainability was not a well understood concept, and the economy was treated as a world unto itself. Thanks to people here today and people all over Ontario, we're now seeing that connection and better understanding the connection between our environment and our economy. More importantly, we see that connection not as a strict limit to growth and prosperity, but as an opportunity to redefine growth and prosperity and renew the promise of a brighter tomorrow for our children, and I will say our grandchildren. It's our obligation to pursue this opportunity, to be leaders in our time, to use evidence and innovation, and to do everything in our power to put this province and this planet on a path that sustains prosperity. With the decisions our government has made to invest in you and invest in a low-carbon future, and with the work that CIGI and across Greater Waterloo region, the work that's being done by academics, entrepreneurs, and established industries, I have every confidence that we'll respond to the challenges of our time with purpose, and we will seize new opportunities with confidence. That is what we must do, and the rest is up to history. Thank you very much. Merci. Miigwech. It says it right here, Premier.
Oh, gosh. We plan things
You have to
well
read the
here
floor.
at CIGI. Yes. Well, Premier, thank you for your remarks and for giving us a sense in, I guess, pragmatic terms, how some of these dichotomies, as Jim said, might be made to go away, but even as we make them go away, it's not easy. If it were, most of us would be out of business.
Well, we would have done it by now.
We would have done it.
Yeah.
The low-hanging fruit are gone. And we took the liberty of asking people in the audience to write in questions, because I know we only have 10 minutes to talk. And I've been receiving
You've got a
lots
big stack of questions.
Yes, I do. And I've summarized them in basically 2 or 3 thoughts. And I've been receiving a bigger stack by email.
Great.
Since people. One obvious theme that comes up is, even if we make these dichotomies go away, and you gave some examples of how sustainability and prosperity go hand in hand, it does require an upfront investment often, both of time, but also financial dollars. And knowing what we know about financial situations in the provinces and here too, I guess 2 questions. One is, how much of this is really feasible, and then how much can we not afford to do? But secondly, what role for the private sector and for public-private partnerships to make this happen?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I and we as a government don't see this as an option. We don't see making the kinds of investments that are necessary as an option. We know that we have to keep making those investments. And in fact, in our budget last year, we took a risk and we ran on a policy and a plan of investment at a time when, as I said in my remarks, there were lots of voices saying you should just cut and slash and focus only on eliminating the deficit. And we said, we will hold to reducing and eliminating the deficit by 2017-18, but we are not going to do that at the expense of making the investments that we know are necessary. So, I used the example of regional express rail, but we could talk about transit and transportation infrastructure all over the province. We could talk about the kinds of buildings that we need. We can talk about the investments in energy. And we're going to do that in a number of ways. We've laid out how we will raise revenue. The review of assets is one. We have raised some revenue in terms of taxation. We have already embarked on that. But you are right in terms of the private sector. We need the private sector to partner with us in many ways. One of those ways is in terms of financing. And, there are lots of discussions about the way we get transit and transportation infrastructure built. And we have demonstrated in Ontario, I think, that we're able to build more because the private sector has been willing to take some of the risk in terms of budgets and timing. And so we've done building that we would not have been capable of doing. I think the other role for the private sector, and this is not directly about funding, but it is about the political and public discussion, that we need the private sector and government and people who are in the academic realm and in NGOs to be on the same page, or at least to be grappling with the same problems and not to be silent, so that to the extent that the business world understands that sustainability is in their best interest and that there are opportunities in sustainability, we need that to be part of the public discussion, because that allows for investment. It gives social permission as well as economic permission to make the kinds of investments that we know we need to make, and to make the kinds of tough decisions. It's not easy to review the assets of this province. Governments have tried it, and have tried to recycle and have tried to make those investments in the past, and it hasn't worked. We're determined to make it work.
So the private sector is one piece in that puzzle. The other is moving beyond Ontario, and this is therefore the CIGI composite question. You alluded to the fact that the province is part of a federation, and then of course Canada is part of the community of countries. There must be limits to provinces choosing to do this on their own. Put another way, what would you like to see in an ideal world happen at the global level in terms of something either on carbon taxes or anything else that would make your job implementing all of your ideas easier?
Well, I'm going to start from where I am and work up to that, because I came into this job a couple of years ago, and I was already part of a government that had made decisions about sustainability and about reducing greenhouse gas emissions in specific. And I was determined to stay on that path. I was determined to stay on the path that had been laid out by Dalton McGuinty and our government previously. And what that meant was I arrived at the table of Canada's premiers at a time when there was a Canadian energy strategy that was being developed. It was largely being driven by the West, and it was largely about transportation of fuel across the country. So there was a lot of discussion about pipeline and about what that would mean for the relationship among the provinces. The discussion changed because I wanted to introduce sustainability, and I wanted to introduce environmental responsibility, and I wanted to introduce discussions around climate change into that. But I was not, except BC was already there, but we didn't have a lot of allies. The fact that Quebec has become part of this discussion in a very active way and has obviously taken action has really helped in terms of the national trajectory of that discussion. So what would help the broader discussion in the country would be if we had a federal government that had in place a framework, and that in turn would help us as subnationals, as we go to Paris or we go and talk to other countries. We would be in a better position, I think, if we were working with our federal government to be able to take that place on the international stage and to be able to then have a better discussion about how we could have regulatory regimes or policy mechanisms that were international that would help us locally. It's harder, I think, for subnationals to have that discussion, but that's not going to deter us. You know, we are going to be there. My hope is that we will be able to, even in the absence of a federal framework or federal policy, that we'll be able to make our point and take part in those international discussions. And in that way, then reinforce what's going on here in Canada.
Okay. Something that came up this morning, and I know often comes up, is citizens' attitudes to policies towards the environment.
Right.
And the second side to it is, well, you're not going to be able to make any serious change, whether it's cap and trade, carbon, anything else, if the proverbial man on the street doesn't get it or doesn't support it. What is your sense of the support for these kinds of policies that you've espoused in Ontario, and what should citizens be doing?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question in two ways. First of all, I believe that there is much, much more awareness. And we talked about polling data this morning, you know, from different jurisdictions. And there's a lot of information that would suggest that people in Ontario are much more aware and much more concerned about future sustainability than they were even 20 years ago. And that there's a much broader base of concern. So I would suggest 20, 30 years ago, there were pockets of people who were very concerned. I don't have the polling data on that, but that is my understanding, that there were pockets of people. I think now what you've got is a broad base of people, a majority of people who see weather patterns changing. They know that there is something wrong in terms of our ability to maintain everything that we do in exactly the same way. And so I think that there's a broad acceptance of that. Where there's less acceptance is on what to do about that and how any change will change their lives. So when we have a discussion about carbon pricing, the anxiety that that people feel doesn't necessarily translate into support for taking an action like that. And part of that is because it's not well understood, you know, and it's all very well for us in Ontario to say that, well, BC has taken action and it's been a good thing. We heard this morning that you know, what goes on in Sweden has been a huge economic opportunity. The decisions have made for a much more prosperous and sustainable future. But people in Ontario live in Ontario and they haven't had that experience. And so our job as government is to have enough of a public discussion as we make changes that people understand where it is we're going, why we're going, and how our actions connect with their anxiety about sustainable future.
Great. And I hope that CIGI and others can play a part in that.
CIGI is going to play a very important role, as I said this morning.
Indeed. Public education is half the story in some of these
Well, I would
technical
suggest
issues.
every person in this room, because you're in this room, you care about these issues, you want us to be successful, and I don't mean us as a government, I mean us as a society. And so every single person in this room has a role to play in their personal lives. We all have a role to play in our personal lives, and that goes to the kind of houses we build, the decisions we make about transportation, all of those things. But there's a broader role that we have to play, which is when we go out for dinner, when we are talking to the people in our lives who may not share the same perspective, that we work to explain what it is our concerns are and what we see as the solutions.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Sorry, a few quick comments. Just before we adjourn, I want to thank again Premier Wynne for coming to Waterloo and sharing your thoughts both at the CIGI Roundtable this morning and at this public discussion this afternoon about Ontario prosperity and sustainability. Thank you also to Ro Hinton for moderating the conversation and reflecting the questions of the audience. I'm advised that the Premier must now quickly make her way to her next appointment in an action-packed schedule of meetings here in Waterloo. So I ask the audience to please remain seated for just a few moments while the Premier makes her exit, and perhaps while she's doing so to once more express our thanks for engaging with the people of Waterloo today. Thank you.